Welcome to Dark Conduit, where shadows whisper and the unseen is brought into the eerie light of your screen. Here, we delve into the depths of horror and suspense, narrating tales that will chill your spine and haunt your dreams. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. Welcome to the nightmare.
We're thrilled to have you.
Neighbors lurking in the dark. Okay, so I've had a few issues with my next door neighbor since I moved in, but nothing creepy until just recently. There is a man, a woman, and at least one boy living there, and I mostly just avoid them. The man seems okay, but a bit weird, and the boy just keeps to himself. The woman is quite a bit off. Not long after we moved in, she left a note in my mailbox. Our mailboxes are right beside each other, between our houses. Anyway, I stood at the mailbox reading the note. She thought that my dog was pooping in her yard. It was possible, as our fence had some holes in it, that our dog had gotten out then, but those holes had been fixed a long time ago. Still, no big deal. Except, I noticed her standing in her driveway, just staring at me. And the note was very long. I kept reading it. The more I read, the crazier it got, and the weirder her behavior in my peripheral vision became. Apparently, I was entitled. She seemed to think I was somehow instructing my dog to poop in their yard. Her note went on a tangent about how awful dogs are. She was also 100% convinced it was my dog, even though there are always tons of loose dogs, cats, and wildlife wandering around, and no doubt traveling through her unfenced backyard. In my peripheral vision, she got into her SUV, backed out of her driveway, then parked it along the street directly behind me, and just idled there, staring. The note then went on a weird, long tirade about the previous family to live in my house, saying I was Anther Deb, as if I'd have any idea at all what that is even supposed to mean. Then concluded in some odd insults and some implied not quite threats. This was the closest thing we had ever had to a conversation at this point. I can understand not wanting a dog pooping in her yard, but this was a bit of an extreme reaction, as this was literally the first time I'd even heard of there being a problem. A simple note would have done, but this note was insane. She was still staring behind me. I decided to try to ignore her and just go to my house. That's when she shouted out her window, "Are you playing a game?" That reaction made no sense. "Are you nuts?" I replied as I officially ran out of patience. She shouted more nonsense and insults at me while blocking my driveway, which was right next to the mailboxes, with her vehicle, while I repeatedly told her to leave before I called the cops. This went back and forth like that for a while, but she eventually sped off when I pulled my cell out. Later, my boyfriend, who had not been home at the time this happened, important, had a chat with the neighbors. He said they seemed agreeable and reasonable and basically dismissed me of just being dramatic. The woman told a very different version of events, of course. I was annoyed that my boyfriend wasn't taking me seriously, but let it go. I think he just wanted to keep getting along with the man next door, as they sometimes borrowed tools. They speak to him a lot differently than how they speak to me, and they don't do anything rude to me while he is around. In fact, they don't speak to me when he is around at all. They always wait for him to be away. Anyway, I mostly just avoid them. Sometimes the woman stares at me, but I just ignore her. Until recently, I have been mostly successful. Here's the creepy story. I don't sleep well at night when I'm home alone, and I'm always home alone now because my boyfriend is out of country on business for months at a time. I often feel like there's someone just outside my house or at my door. Sometimes my dogs act up at odd hours, but I never see anyone. I keep my house alarm armed and pistol in my nightstand. The other night was one such night. I didn't sleep well and kept having a sinking feeling that something was wrong. Anyway, I got out of bed at about 2 a.m. because I thought I was scheduled to work at 3 a.m. I had mostly given up on getting a restful sleep then anyway. As I left my house, I heard something to my left, the direction of my neighbor's house, but didn't see anything. I was always nervous in my driveway because the motion sensor light was broken. There was always a lot of darkness between my door and my truck. So I always moved quickly in my driveway. I got in my truck and went to work. It turned out that I misread my schedule and didn't work at 3 that morning after all. Annoyed at the mistake, but grateful I'd get to go home and sleep a little more before the actual start of my shift at 7, I went home. I pulled into my driveway and didn't see anything in the beam of my truck's headlights. I always look around my truck before getting out. I turned the headlight off and got out. I took a few steps ahead of my truck. Then all of a sudden, a large man called out to me, shouted, really, from the shadows at the corner of my house. He scared the living crap out of me so bad that I screamed, reached for my pepper spray, and fell down. Not useful. He apologized in a tone that didn't sound sorry at all. It was my neighbor, and that wasn't much of a relief. Edit. It took me a few minutes hunched over on the ground to collect myself enough to find out WTF he wanted. I was seriously freaking out and kind of having a mini panic attack. My heart was racing and I was shaking. I was obviously visibly upset throughout all that follows. Apparently, it was my fault that he occasionally found trash in his yard in windy Colorado. Complaining about this seemed to be a lot more important issue than scaring the hell out of a woman alone at night. He showed no real concern or realization that was even wrong at all. Again, I have no problem with neighbors bringing issues to my attention, but seriously, hey, can you make sure trash from your bins isn't blowing into my yard? Thanks, bye is not a statement that takes 10 freaking minutes, nor is it one that needs to be addressed at 3 the freaking morning. I nod in agreement to keep the peace, but I know the trash isn't mine. We live in a windy area. Trash gets blown around in people's yards all the time. No big deal. But he just would not stop going on about it. He kept needlessly repeating himself and made some not quite but kind of threat about getting along. Edit. Think along the lines of those "it would be a shame if something were to happen" type sort of threats. He was keeping me busy. I didn't even notice his wife flank me. Before I even knew she was there, she appeared from the shadows by a tree. She wanted to yell at me about some eggs. A few weeks ago, I found a bunch of eggs smashed on the road near our shared mailbox. As the carton was right next to them, I thought the carton had obviously just been dropped. Not that someone was trying to egg anything. I assumed my neighbor had dropped the eggs on her way to get the mail and just left them. She denies this, but I still think that's the most likely explanation because no one else has any reason to be out our mailbox with eggs. But I didn't care enough to say anything to her about it at the time, so I had just it go and forgot all about it. Now she was accusing me of leaving eggs around, again, inexplicably expressing the grievance at 3 a.m. Weird that she hadn't brought it up weeks ago when it happened, but I know why she didn't. My boyfriend was still here then. My boyfriend has been away on business for several weeks now, long enough for them to have noticed his absence. They were also probably aware that my motion sensor light was out. They sure seemed to know how to avoid my headlight beams. Sure, it could be a coincidence, but did I mention that this was all at 3 a.m., not some other dark yet reasonable for person to be outside hour? Being surprisingly patient, I explained that I knew nothing about the eggs. I mentioned that I later found a lot of the shells in my yard and figured a squirrel must have carried them there. She proudly informed me that she tossed them onto my yard herself. Apparently she thought that was okay, but someone dropping them in the first place isn't. Anyway, this is where I started to get over my shock a bit and started getting pissed. Initially, I had been somewhat relieved that the man in the shadows had been my neighbor, not some random crazy person. But now, I was pissed. I had now been outside with them for something like 20 minutes, while they accosted me about stupid crap, while I tried to be polite and agreeable, even though I had nothing to do with it. But now, everything wrong with the situation had kicked in. I eventually remembered that I don't actually have to put up with any of this and cut her off mid-rant and said, "It's 3 a.m. I'm going home. Good night," and turned on my heel. I heard her say something in an unkind tone as I left, but didn't catch what it was. They had staked out my house, waited for my BF to leave, and long enough to be sure he was gone, all to complain about some inane crap long after it supposedly even happened. If they have concerns, surely there are better times to address them than at 3 a.m. What the hell were they doing out at 3 a.m. anyway, man? Men had totally purposely hid in a shadow at the corner of my house where he could avoid my headlights and didn't reveal himself until I was out of my truck and exposed. And shouldn't the woman have walked up beside her husband, not gone around while I was distracted? They keep doing odd behavior, never enough that they're doing anything illegal or anything to report the police. But none of this is normal behavior. Honestly, I think these complaints are just excuses, and they're really just taking the opportunity to intimidate me. I think they're messing with me on purpose. Then again, I could be wrong. They could just be weird and incredibly socially inept, but otherwise harmless. Either way, I will be installing a motion light soon. I was so shaken up and had my adrenaline so high from someone scaring me from a blind spot by my house. Because seriously, that could have been someone else and a lot worse, that I didn't really get any sleep before work. The tent in the trees. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces airman, military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off, starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go! Let's get the fuck out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by two men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way we had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing was all gone, though he could tell people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to the area and do not intend to. As our journey through the shadows comes to a close, we want to extend a heartfelt thank you for watching. Your presence illuminates the darkest corners of our tales, and it's you, our brave viewers, who make Dark Conduit truly alive. Remember, if tonight's tale has left a whisper in your ear or a shadow in your heart, support us by hitting that like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Every like, comment, and share helps us keep the lanterns burning and the stories flowing. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to become a permanent traveler in our eerie adventures. Until next time, keep the lights dim and your curiosity alight. Thank you, and good night from Dark Conduit.